On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface. It was a landmark exploration for humans. Today in conversation with Dr. Chris Gainor, the president of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Welcome to Pembroke, Chris.
Great to be here.
That was a big deal. It's the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. Do you remember it? I'm sure you do. What were you doing that day?
I sure do, because I got into space exploration even a few years before that. I was very young. I won't say how young, but yeah, this was an event I've been looking forward to for a long time, and of course there was a lot of excitement in the days leading up to it. So I was all ready and parked in front of the TV to watch the whole thing from the launch, right through the splashdown.
It was a big deal for millions of people around the world. What do you remember? You would have been watching on a black and white TV, probably pretty small. It was a grainy picture. But what do you take with you 50 years later from that moment, watching it?
Well, that's, there's so many aspects that whole moonwalk, and I have the whole thing on DVD. I've watched it a number of times because each time you watch it, you kind of get something else out of it. And the first time, Neil Armstrong comes down the ladder and says his one small step thing, and the first time people heard it, they didn't. What did he just say? Like Walter Cronkite says that, and then he said, well, he said, the color guy says, he said this, but then it's just kind of like, this is really happening. This is a guy on the moon, and this is like right out of science fiction, and so yeah, but a lot of people, they watch the first step, but what follows is kind of two and a half hours of kind of nerdy science stuff, interspersed with a couple of ceremonies, like when President Nixon called them up and all this. But not many people stuck it through to the end like I did.
Well, let's take a step back. I want to talk primarily today about the Apollo missions and the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. But let's talk a little bit about politics and how this plays into the moon landing. So if we come out of World War II, the Cold War begins. Nikita Khrushchev is the premier of the Soviet Union. John Kennedy is the president as of 1960 of the United States. And there is this battle between democracy, the free world, and communism. And that really is the backdrop in this space race, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wonder today, if the circumstances at that time had been just a little different, whether the moon landing would have actually taken place much later than it did, or perhaps it might not have even taken place by the present day if things had been a little different. But there's just a number of coincidences that happen there, in addition to kind of the general Cold War situation. You may have heard of Andrei Sakharov, who,
yes,
before he was a human rights crusader in the Soviet Union, he was their chief designer of hydrogen bombs. And in the 1950s, the Politburo went to Sakharov and said, how much is the bomb going to weigh? How big a missile do we need to make? And he said, it'll be about 3 or 4 tons. And so they started building a missile that could loft that, to the United States or wherever. And then it came out that they would only need about 1 ton. So what happened is they already started to build this rocket that was much bigger than they needed for a hydrogen bomb, but it was perfect to launch people and payloads into space. The Americans were more advanced, actually, with their miniaturization, so their early missiles would only launch 1 ton. So this was why the Russians were ahead of the Americans. So they got ahead of the Americans, sending the first satellite, the first dog, the first human, the first woman, and various other things ahead of the Americans. Strangely enough, because their technology was a little bit behind the Americans, but there was also a lot of secrecy. And then President Kennedy comes into office. He's embarrassed by Yuri Gagarin's flight. 3 or 4 days later, he's further embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs in Cuba,
Yes.
another arena in the Cold War. And he says, let's go to the moon. And this is forgotten, but the Congress agreed with him that they should commit all this money and effort to go to the moon. So it happened. And because there's been times since then when presidents have said, actually both Presidents Bush, both the Bush presidents have tried to stir things up. Let's go to Mars or something like that, and it hasn't really happened.